All right, our speaker today. As her biography slide suggests, Martha Olson has an extensive educational background in, well, education. Martha also believes in the value of education and in the value of providing for the establishment and maintenance of a thorough and uniform system of free public schools throughout the state, as required in Article 9, Section 2 of the Colorado Constitution. This afternoon, Martha's going to explain to us how the state of Colorado finances its free public schools and consider whether there are better methods to meet the mandate in Colorado's Constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, Martha Olson.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Thanks. You took the slide right out of me. Thank you very much, and thank you for your gracious introduction. How many of you here today attended a public school at some point in your life? Yeah, most of the room did, as did I. So you understand the value of public education in our community and the value that that public education gave to your own life and perhaps the lives of your children and grandchildren as well. Public education has been an really important part of our national ethos, I think, since the Founding Fathers. Now, over the last 40 years, there's been a whole movement, maybe we can date it to Newt Gingrich, maybe Ronald Reagan, to question the value of public investment and the value of public investment in our schools, with the argument going that people need more choice, that the schools are too bureaucratic, that they're inefficient, that they're ineffective. I would argue that the better question is, what can we do to make our public schools the very best that they can be so all of our kids are equipped to compete in the 21st century, that they're equipped not only to compete, but to thrive as human beings. And I think that question goes back more to the value of our Founding Fathers, and I'm getting away from myself here, and the value established in our own state constitution, it was just mentioned, from 1876, that the state of Colorado should provide a free, thorough, and uniform system of education to all of the children in our state. So, Colorado's children are a pretty diverse lot. At this point, there's just under 1 million kids in the state attending public schools. They attend schools in 178 districts. Most of those districts are rural, but the majority of our kids go to school in the Front Range in urban or suburban districts. There's a great deal of diversity among the kids themselves. 47% are children of color, and 41% come from families with very low incomes. The distinction I'm making between families eligible for free lunch and families eligible for reduced price lunch is one of degree, but it comes into play later when we talk about the school financing formula in Colorado. So it's not that Colorado doesn't spend a lot of money on schools. It takes up about 40% of our state budget every year. I think another reflection of that is in Colorado, our state budget is confined to a certain size pie most of the time, but education, and especially kindergarten through 12 education, does take up a big piece of that pie. Most of that money is distributed to the school districts and the schools through something called the School Finance Act, which I'll talk about, and then there's a separate pot that's divided up into grants to go for special programs for kids with special needs, for gifted and talented programs, for kids that are learning English as a second language, and programs like that. Now, the state share of that big piece of the pie last year amounted to about $4.5 billion. There's a local share as well that's critical to funding the schools, and that came in last year at about $2.6 billion. Now, many of you might wonder how I got into this kind of thing. From being a lawyer, I was lucky enough to go to public schools. I went to public university. I think at that point I paid $250 a semester in tuition. I was lucky to get a scholarship to NYU Law School. And then I was fortunate enough to be able to choose the best school I could for my kids in New York City. But when I stopped practicing law and started thinking about what I wanted to do next, I thought, you know, it's really not fair that people like me can get our kids a really good education, but there are so many kids in New York City at that point was where I was living, so many kids around the country that don't have the resources, don't come from the kind of families that can provide the resources to give their kids the best. They need good public schools. So I decided to go back and do something about it. I taught, ended up in administration and running a program that provided 2 years of free college classes and a free associate in arts degree to kids while they were in high school. And that program, we ran schools not only in New York City, but in Newark, Baltimore, Cleveland, in places where the school districts were pretty distressed and the kids were very much in need. So getting back to this, so when I came out here, I thought, you know, I should do something in education here, and I realized at that point last year, until last year, Colorado wasn't even able to provide a free kindergarten education to kids across the state. Some districts could do so, some schools could do so, some parents could pay for that extra half day of school, but it wasn't something that was available to everybody. And I thought, you know, this is something I need to work on. So here I am. So I've taken a deep dive into the school finance formula in Colorado. And that's what takes up the bulk of the state funding in the school here. So what's important to know about our school finance formula, and it goes through lots of iterations before it actually gets to the school, is it was based on what was needed in 1994 for a thorough and uniform public education in Colorado. So think about in 1994, the point of public schools in 1994 and the point of state funding then was to make sure that every child around the state had access to school. Well, this is 2019. We've had lots of things going on in education since then. And now the question is, does this formula in 1994 meet the needs of our schools and especially our children in 2019? 1994 was before there were state standards. It was before there were accountability requirements imposed on school districts, imposed on schools, imposed on teachers, imposed on students. It was before there were standardized tests, of course, but it was before we had such a regime of keeping track of how every child did every year and how every teacher did every year. So things have changed a lot since then. A couple other things to note about the school finance formula now is it doesn't really take into account the needs of the kids that walk through the door of a school, something that the school has nothing control over. Who are those kids attending the school? What kind of needs do they have? And now the final piece of the school finance formula in Colorado, and this is what to me is really upsetting when I started digging into it, is that we come up with this formula and then the state has to balance its budget. And how does the state balance its budget? With that 40% of state's spending, it cuts off a percentage across the board of the money that the schools get every year. This has been happening since 2010 and the Great Recession. So the whole thing is always adjusted downward by the negative factor. And here's what that looks like for several random school districts across the state, including Boulder Valley. You see, they get a figure. The figure differs depending on the number of kids, the size of the district, how many kids have come from families with low incomes. But then, here it's a flat 8.5% basically is taken off of that to come up with the amount of money each school gets. Now, line by line, it might not look like a lot, but over the course of the last 10 years, that figure for Boulder Valley amounts to $280 million. And for the state as a whole, it's $8 billion. So that's a lot of money that was meant to have gone to the schools, but is now being used to balance the state budget. So it's also a very worthy effort, but we can question priorities here too. So I mentioned before that there was a local share component to school funding, and that local share plays out in a couple different ways. First, with the local share, also the state has local control. So once the money gets to the school districts, it's up to the school district to decide how that money should be spent. How much should be allocated for teachers, how much for supplies, how much for sports, how much does the transportation and how much do the school bus drivers need. So that's a local decision made by our locally elected school boards who hire the superintendent. So we all have some say in this game. But at the local level also, most of the money comes from property taxes. And there's a few things here I just want to point out. The assessment rate. In Colorado, after the Gallagher Act and the Gallagher Amendment to the state constitution, the amount of money that was paid by residential property tax owners had to be kept at a certain ratio to the money paid by non-residential property owners. So, and that ratio is 45%. So when property values go up, the assessment rates go down. This was from a couple of years ago. It was 7.96 valuation on property. Now it's about 7.15. So then you get the assessment value. Okay, the assessed value. So the mill is the amount of money that's actually levied on the property. So if each mill is worth 1/10 of 1%. So if your assessed value is 7.15, for example, and your property is valued at $100,000, your assessment value is, now I do my math, $7,150, and your mill is $7.15. So that makes up the taxes that you owe on your property. Now, also in Colorado, it's up to the local districts to decide how many mills they want to impose on their taxpayers for any given year with limitations. But you can see from this formula that there's a couple of different things that come out that are subject to unequal outcomes. One is the property values around the state vary widely. So property in Boulder is going to be worth a lot more than property in Pueblo, for example. But yet when the assessment rate is determined, that's determined statewide. So whenever housing prices go up in the Front Range and the assessment value goes down statewide because we're such a big part of the state, then somebody in Pueblo or Blanca is going to see a decrease in the amount of local money going to schools. The other thing that varies a lot is how many mills has any district levied and how much money is each mill worth. In Boulder, each mill is worth about $223 a student. In Pueblo, it's worth $62 a student. In Aspen, it's worth about $1,700 a student. So you can see there's some inequities built into the system just by relying on local property taxes. And how does that play out in terms of state funding? In Colorado, remember, we have this basic amount that's supposed to go to the schools. How Where that money comes from is then figured out by how much can local communities contribute. So in Aspen, for example, it's a wealthy community. They contribute 75% of the cost of their schools. In Pueblo, which actually imposes more mills on its residents and taxes them much more, they can only contribute 25% because of those inequities. It plays out in a lot of different ways too. There's, in Telluride, for example, another wealthy community, they were able to build a 30,000 square foot state-of-the-art theater for their kids to work in. Blanca, which is a small town in south central Colorado, has one school in its district, a budget of under $1 million a year. And for a long time, they've been paying about 63% of their entire school budget for utilities because the insulation in the building is so bad, and they're relying on propane for heating. So that's what kind of happens across the state. And because Boulder's got such a good schools district here, and we fund our schools very well here, and our families can contribute to the funding of the schools, we're in a much different position, and it's easy to lose track of what's going on around the state. So what's happened to our school funding over the last 20 years has been kind of a reversal of where things started out being, and a reversal of maybe what should be ideal. You could say ideally be a 50-50 split, local, state. And here what's happened is that because of these fluctuations in the mill levy and the assessment values and all of the things that went into making up local share, the state has had to put in more and more money to fund the schools at a local level while the local share has gone down. But what's happened, instead of that new state money going in to pay for better programs in our schools or higher teacher salaries or whatever your school needs, it's gone to backfill the reducing amounts of property taxes that have been collected. So our kids don't come out ahead. Our state budget is really squeezed, and we end up in this situation where our per pupil funding now in Colorado is over $2,000 below the national average. It's below what's spent in Alabama and Mississippi. And yet at the same time, Colorado is in the top bracket of states for economic growth and for wealth. So you can kind of see what happened when Gallagher and the property tax amendment was passed. The rates could go up and down. That by itself didn't have a real impact on our schools. But then when Tabor was passed, which restricted the amount of money that could be raised, and it actually had these unintended consequences around property taxes because it meant that rates could no longer float up, they could only go down, we got into a real problem. Amendment 23 was a huge initiative across the state in 2000 that was meant to reverse some of that and bring the state back up to average. But what happened then was the Great Recession hit. And because of Tabor, our state's economy really couldn't recover unless we started figuring out how to balance the budget. What do you go to? You go to the biggest piece of the pie, and that's our schools. So what's been the impact of all of this on our schools? Well, one of the things, I always go to the teachers first because they're, I think, the most important component of a kid's experience in school, and how much a child is going to learn depends on what kind of teachers they get. Our teachers work incredibly hard, but 95% of the teachers in rural Colorado would qualify for reduced price lunch for their kids. They're not making enough to earn a living wage. They're working 2 or 3 jobs, and that has a huge impact on the classroom. It also has a huge impact on what's happening in terms of recruiting new teachers and in our teacher shortage around the state, 3,000 unfilled position. And that's really one of the reasons that so many states, so many of our districts are on 4-day weeks. It's not that they can't keep the lights open, but they can't pay their teachers more, so a recruiting tool is you only have to work 4 days a week. That way you have more time for another job, is basically what it amounts to. So with all of this going on, there's been a natural reduction in the number of young people who want to go into teaching. On a school level, that plays out. There's a big shortage of math and science teachers. You know, are they the ones that we want to be missing in our schools? There's a huge shortage of teachers for kids with special needs. And these are our most vulnerable students, and they're hurt the most by a constant turnover. Something that I don't think about as often, but that's also really important. When you ask districts around the state, how have these budget cuts impacted them? They'll say, we can't pay for bus drivers. We can't take our kids to and from school anymore because we can't find bus drivers willing to work for us. We can't find kitchen workers. We can't find paraprofessionals to help our teachers in the classroom. They can all earn more now going down the street and working at McDonald's than they could working for us part-time. So, you know, all of that makes for what is a good, healthy school. And in too many of our schools, that's becoming really hard to accomplish. So the impact on kids, too, is, I always go to this, we really are failing the kids that need good schools the most. The kids coming in from low-income households, those kids speak a fraction of the number of words when they start school that kids from our families do. They're the ones that are hurt the most when there are too big of class sizes, when there aren't special programs for them and their needs aren't being met. So the achievement gap here, or I like to call it the opportunity gap, is one of the largest in the country. Our kids aren't having, they want to do science, they want to enroll in science projects around the country. A lot of those schools that they attend don't have science labs, don't have the equipment that they need for science in the 21st century. We've got one school psychologist for 1,200 kids, you know, and this is at a time when our kids are hearing about mass shootings in schools all the time. So it's really got an impact on our schools and on our kids and on our teachers. So you might say, you know, that's a lot of money. The kids are the schools are going to be fine like they are. We've muddled through for 10 years. We can keep on muddling through. But the reality is that in the long term, the amount of funding that goes into our public schools really does make a difference. And for those schools that have a sustained increase in funding so that it plays out over the lifetime of a child in school, it really makes a difference, especially for kids from low-income families. They're much more likely to graduate from high school, and they earn more money as adults as well. So, what are we going to do about this in Colorado? The nice thing about Colorado is that here the voters make tax policy because of Tabor. So, we have on our ballots this year Proposition CC. It was passed out by the state legislature, by our very own Casey Becker, actually, from Boulder. Proposition CC would enable the state to keep whatever revenues were collected under existing tax rates in good times as well as in bad times. And what do I mean by that? The Tabor Amendment requires the state to give back any excess revenues it collects over and above a set limit that's governed by population size and inflation. So when the economy's good, a lot of times tax revenues come in over that number, and Tabor requires that those revenues be rebated back to the taxpayer. This year, I think for 2019, 2020, we're estimating, because the economy's been good, there's maybe an extra $310 million that's going to be collected, that if it were not for the Tabor cap, the state could keep that money and invest it. And what property Proposition CC says is, let the state keep that money and invest it in three things: public education, kindergarten through 12, you've seen the need, I hope, higher education, we're maybe 48th in the country in terms of what we provide in support for our public universities, and roads and transportation. And we all drive, so we know what state the roads are in and how much more transit we could actually use. So that's what Proposition CC would do. It would do the same thing that most of the taxing entities around the state have done: municipalities, school districts, fire districts. Most of them, when they go out to the voters now, build in an exemption to Tabor so that they can keep any excess revenues that come in. But the state hasn't done that yet. Now, opponents will say, this is a hidden tax increase. You know, we paid those taxes. We were promised that we'd get a refund sometimes, and we should get that. So that's one argument. Another argument against it is that the legislature says this is how it's going to spend the money, but will it really spend the money this way? And the third one, I think, is really more of a concern about what this will mean for our Tabor and Taxpayer Bill of Rights as a whole. So people are looking ahead to what might happen in a couple of years. So we all have the choice. I don't know, my ballot's at home sitting on my desk. Yours probably are too at this point. So we all get to decide that in Colorado. And what I would like to leave with is that, you know, our budgets, our tax policy should reflect the values that we have as members of a community and as citizens of Colorado. And going back to the beginning and the importance of education, Benjamin Franklin, you know, you can never spend too much money on education. It's a great investment. I want you to think about that and whether we're actually investing in education the way our values would suggest we should. So this has been a dry subject. My slides are pretty dry. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. So, yes.
I perhaps should know this, but I don't, but maybe you do. In terms of compared with other states, what is how does the state of Colorado rank in terms of the income tax rate that we impose on our citizens? I mean, I just completed my 2018 taxes just a couple of weeks ago because I always extend for lots of different reasons. And you know, what I paid the federal government was 10 times what I paid the state of Colorado. I mean, it was almost embarrassing the amount of tax I paid, the small amount of tax I paid to the state of Colorado. I mean, it has nothing to do, I mean, everything you just said here was great, but there's a part of me that says, as citizens of Colorado, we don't pay enough tax anyway.
Yeah. I'm not an expert in tax policy as a whole for the state, but our taxes are very low compared to most of the rest of the country. We have a flat tax of 4.63%, so it is low for the rest of the country. I would also say that our property taxes are very low compared to the rest of the country as well. Those of you who've moved here from the East Coast probably recognize that right away.
So how have charter schools been involved in the money to go to other public schools? Has that created a loss of income, say, to other public schools? The use of charter schools.
Yeah, charter schools are included. If they're nonprofit public charter schools, they get the same funding that public schools do. So there's no real decrease there. I would say the impact of charter schools is in the number of students that are attending those schools, who those students are compared who's left in the regular public schools. And there might be, you know, more kids with more needs left in the public schools because of a charter school moving into the neighborhood. And that in turn affects the climate and the funding and the efficacy of the public school. So, but they, in Colorado, they get pretty much the same funding. Yes?
So seeing the inequities that you presented there between the spending on certain districts, Boulder, Aspen,
Yeah.
a district, if I read it right, had 174 students in it or something like that. What is the barrier to consolidation so that we get more equity in terms of the distribution of the districts we have?
Yeah. I think consolidation is something that's looked at a lot and makes sense in many places. I think the reaction in Colorado has been, the expanses are so big. The rural districts would be so big that you don't want to have kids spending 2 hours one way on a bus to get to school every day. So that's why we have such small districts, which presents a unique challenge to Colorado. I think consolidation is a really good question to have when you're looking at districts that are in the Front Range, for example, where there's a lot of districts very close together, and maybe there could be some economies of scale. But the problem is really with the rural areas here in the state, just the isolation and the length of time it takes to get from school to school or from community to school. And I would say the other thing in some of these communities, the public school is the community. That's the place that everybody gathers around. So if you take that away from a town of 2,000, you're going to really have a big impact on that community. So there's a couple different things going on there. So some states have looked at how do we redistribute property taxes, things like that. I think the first thing to look at is, how are we going to better figure out how much these schools need, and then we figure out how we can pay for it.
I got one on your right, over here.
Yes.
It's a two-part question. It doesn't
Okay.
have to do with the finances. It has more to do with the education. I grew up never having a 4-day week. So the first question is, what have the studies shown that the kids are doing on that 5th day? Because I'm assuming that the parents are not just taking the day off to care for the kid.
Yeah.
And the second part of the question is, what's the 5 to 10 year vision of incorporating any sort of online or computational method to educate those children on the 5th day so that the budget can be reduced, mass education can be given because of the efficiency of electronic delivery?
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack. And I think 4-day school weeks are pretty new here in Colorado, so we can't track the long-term trends of it. I can say that they've created real havoc for the families in those districts, and there's been a lot of scrambling for what are we going to do with our kids. And I can say, anecdotally, I've read in some districts where that's happened, there's a change in the police blotter on Friday afternoons too. So, you've got something going on there. I think for online learning, I know a lot of our school districts have been looking at that. I didn't go into that, there's a special tweak in the formula for schools that are doing online learning. But that's not a panacea. I think it's necessary to pursue, but that takes a lot of finances and resources to set up and be effective. And there still has to be an adult paying attention who knows the subject matter to help the student along. Sometimes it works. In some subjects it works better than others, but I don't think that's going to be the answer long term. Yes?
Dr. Peter?
Hi.
I'll bring you the mic after, Dr. Peter. Hi, Martha. Michelle Carpenter
Hi.
from Boulder
Oh,
High.
I didn't see you
I
over
want to say
there.
thank you so much for presenting today. I think in Rotary we hear a lot of stories about things that are going on around the world, and we're like, no way. And then we hear these stories about what's happening right here in Boulder Valley, and I just want to say it's all really true. I can't get a sub. Every morning we get an email, these are all the classes that need to be covered. In our department in world languages, we haven't had new textbooks in over 12 years. So those statistics that are up there are absolutely positively real. I think there are a lot of hidden children. I think there are a lot of hidden families whose needs, when you see them, I actually work with families doing their FAFSA so their kids can go to college. I see what these families are making. There are several hundred families in our district that are way below the poverty level, and they need us. So thank you so much. That's not really a question, it's a statement
No.
of fact, and to say really what
Thank
you're
you.
saying is true.
Thanks.
Thank you. I got quite cranky when I saw the slide that said there was one psychologist for 1,200 students.
Yeah.
What are we doing to address that?
Well, that goes back to the question of how much money are our schools actually getting to begin with. So if a school has a limited budget to choose from, it has to decide, well, you know, I've got $100,000. Can I hire 2 teachers with that? Can I hire, which we need? We haven't had a math teacher in years here, so can I use it to hire a math teacher and maybe a couple of paraprofessionals? Or do I use it to hire a school psychologist or somebody to come and teach special ed? So those are very real choices that each district has to make, and I think probably most districts decide, well, the first important thing is to have a body in every classroom, right? And everything else we'll just kind of make do with. But as the state and our communities really discuss the emotional and psychological and mental health needs of our kids, which are growing given the state of the world that they live in, we have to do more for their social and emotional and mental health needs as well, and we don't have the funding for it. Last year, I know there was a lot of discussion in the state legislature about the need to do more for school mental health, but there was no money behind it. So unless there's more money there, you know, the schools don't have the luxury to even make that choice. Yes?
I don't remember the exact figures you put up about state versus local funding, but I think it added up to somewhere near 10 billion. Was it 7.4 and 2.6 or something like that?
No,
and
yeah.
then what is the expected return of the money? Did you say 300 million or 600 million?
I think the total spending in the state on education this year is probably around 8 billion, the state and local share combined. But the amount of money excess this year is going to be probably around 310 million.
So that's not a great percentage, and how much good is that going to do? In other words, what I'm saying is we really need to increase taxes to pay for school and not think that a little Band-Aid of 300 million will make a great deal of difference.
Yeah, and that 300 million will be restricted for the amount of money that goes to school to one-time expenses. But I don't want to discount the importance of that. We can buy some new textbooks, you know, and we can put air conditioners in the classrooms that don't have it here in Boulder Valley. I know, and some schools can do much more with that, depending on what they need. But it is just a drop in the bucket, and it doesn't do anything to solve the long-term problem. I can say I was a citizen proponent on Amendment 73, which was on the ballot last year. We did better on that amendment than we did on previous attempts to raise taxes for education, but we didn't make the 55% threshold. So it's something that we have to just keep working on, and from my perspective, we just have to keep getting the word out on. You know, at some point, the public investment is worth giving up a little bit of tax money.
So I just want to second what Michelle Carpenter said. My kids went through Fairview, and the teachers there worked harder than anybody I've ever met. They started early in the morning, continued through the school day. After school, they worked with school groups, and our students from Boulder High can second that. And then at night, they graded papers, and the next morning, they were back at it again and again and again. So we need to do something. Regarding CC, Denver Post had this peculiar editorial where they came out against CC, and their reasoning I thought would be one of your 3 reasons, but actually they just quibbled here and quibbled there, little things about it, and they said, man, we're going to be against it. So I'm wondering, is there any background to that, any politics? What's going on with the Post?
I don't know. I can't venture to say anything about the Denver Post and how they came to that decision. I know that there are, you know, a sizable number of people in the state that are worried about any attempt to undo any bit of Tabor. So that's something going on out there. And yeah, I can't tell you. I can't tell you. It'd be nice to be in a perfect world so that the money, you know, we could use this money on an ongoing basis, but you know, it won't be there on an ongoing basis if this is all we can do. But it's a good first step.
Martha, thank you so very much. Those of us who lived a life in education as you have dipped into know that we have lived in a time of scarcity. I don't ever remember a time of plenty. And if we cut, then you had to add back, and what was it? And it really is a value proposition. But you all do good homework, and we know that we're all experts because we all went to school, so we all have opinions about it. And so thank you for taking your time and giving us a good teach today about this. And in your honor, we always in Boulder Rotary donate 100 doses of polio vaccine to the Polio Plus Fund. And as we say, we're just this close. So someday we'll be that close with education. In the meantime, thank you so very, very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.